Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Buzansky, president of Impact Justice. Welcome to today's virtual conversation, Eating Behind Bars, Insights from the Food and Prison Project. Today we have Sam Lewis, executive director of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Leslie Soble, a research fellow at Impact Justice, and the conversation will be moderated by Aishatu Yusuf, director of innovation programs at Impact Justice. Impact Justice is a national innovation and research center based in Oakland, California and Washington, D.C. We work across the country to create a more humane and restorative system of justice. We're hosting these events on a wide range of critical issues on the front lines of justice reform with experts who can help to address the challenges, ideas, and opportunities to help reach our goal. For today's conversation, we wanted to talk about our recently report that we released, Eating Behind Bars, Ending the Hidden Punishment of Food in Prison. Our Food in Prison project team spent 18 months examining the long overlooked issue of the damaging and degrading food served to incarcerated people in this country. You can find the full report now on our website, www.impactjustice.org. But today we're fortunate to have Sam and Leslie, two leading experts with us. To share more about them and to moderate this discussion, I now turn it over to Aishatu Yusuf, Impact Justice's Director of Innovative Program. Thanks again for joining us.
Good. I'm curious if
KJ,
Sam
hi.
is
KJ, we can hear you. So I just wanted to, our wonderful communications director, is working with Sam. So I wanted to say we can hear you. Either way, I'm so excited to be on this webinar with all the folks that are listening in, but most importantly with both Leslie Soble and Sam Lewis, who are here with us today. Just a quick introduction. So Leslie Soble has been with Impact Justice since 2018, excuse me. As an educator and ethnographer, Leslie is the founder and artistic director of Story Soup, which is a project that creates context for dialogue across culture and generations that really focus on food as a narrative. Leslie's academic research focuses on food as culture text, as aesthetic domain, and the site of performance. Leslie has over a decade of experience designing and facilitating workshops that explore identity, systems of oppression, and intercultural and intergeneration communication. So Leslie, so excited to have you as a colleague, but also to have you today on this call with Sam Lewis. And then as our guest of honor, I would like to say, Sam Lewis, who is with us here today. Sam, who is the executive director of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which is a proud partner of Impact Justice, or I'll say it the opposite direction. We are so proud to partner with ARC on so many initiatives that we're all doing. Sam self-purports as a former life prisoner, so Sam understands firsthand the experiences of what being incarcerated is like, and the impacts on both him and his family and his community. Sam created the Hope and Redemption Team, which they go by the acronym HEART, which is a first of its kind initiative that brings together former life prisoners that go back into state facilities that talk about hope and redemption and really help folks transition into society after being in prison. Prior to that, Sam served as the director of Inside Programs and has worked in various capacities with Friends Outside in Los Angeles. In 2018, Sam was the recipient of the Bank of America Neighborhood Builders Award, Uncommon Law Heroes Award, and 2019 Danger Man Award. So with all of those accolades, I'm so excited to be in conversation with both Sam and Leslie today. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Leslie because we're going to kick off this conversation really giving a quick summary of what the Food in Prison report is and about. As you have all know, and as Alex said, the report has been fully released today. And so Leslie's going to give us a quick summary of what that is. So Leslie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Aishatu. And I am going to share my screen for everyone. So give me a moment while I navigate the technology. And I'm getting a message that says the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. So Zach, if you could go ahead and share my screen or let me share my screen, that would be great. Thank you so much. Okay, we are good to go. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Food in Prison Project and why we're focusing on food in prison. It's a question that we often get. And as an ethnographer who studies food, I could go on for hours about how what and how we eat impacts every aspect of who we are. And we're often very aware of how food impacts our physical health, but we don't always realize how much it impacts our mental health, our emotional well-being, the ways that we interact with others. Food really helps us connect to different aspects of our lives. It helps us connect to people and places, to the seasons and rhythms of life, to various communities we belong to. And it's this really amazing thing that blurs our biological and cultural and social selves. And we use food to communicate identity and relationships and values. And it's this huge presence in everything we are and everything we do. And none of that changes when someone is incarcerated. So even though there's this growing movement of good food for all and trying to get access to healthy food for everyone, there hasn't been a lot of conversation about including people who are incarcerated in that movement. There hasn't been a national conversation around prison food. And this is the time of year when people are often calling awareness to food insecurity and to hunger. You know, it's the time around the holidays, and this year, especially with COVID, people are very aware of the impact of the lack of access to healthy food. And yet people still are not talking about the national crisis of prison food, which has been ongoing. It's not something that's new. So the Food in Prison Project is really trying to shine a light on this critical issue. And we spent 18 months, as Alex mentioned, looking through media reports, academic research, legal cases. We conducted a survey, a nationwide survey, to which we had responses from 250 formerly incarcerated people about their eating experiences in confinement. We also had a survey for friends and family members of incarcerated people. We received 230 responses for people to share what they've observed about the impacts of food in confinement on their loved ones. We spoke to over 43 corrections folks to learn more about the food in prison issue from the other side. We spoke to agency leaders, food service administrators at the agency and facility levels, wardens, correctional dietitians, on-the-ground corrections officers. And we visited a number of facilities to see food service in action. So really, we had a really good grounding in the policies and practices and how food service works in correctional facilities, while at the same time being able to center the experiences and voices of those who are incarcerated, who were directly impacted. We also spoke with people who work in gardening and culinary programs in prisons, people who are transforming school and hospital food, experts in public health and nutrition, advocates working in different areas. So we've brought all of this information and all of these people's perspectives together and fused them into this report, which paints a picture of the current prison food experience. And just to share a couple of high-level takeaways from the report, the first one, and really the overarching issue, is that prison food is sending a message both to and about people who are incarcerated. And that message is that those people don't matter, that they're not fully human. And that adds to the shame and stigma of incarceration. And it impacts not only the people who are locked up, but the millions of people who have returned from prison from their time in confinement. And it also affects the 1 in 3 American adults who've had an immediate family member in prison or jail, and the 5.7 million kids who have experienced the incarceration of a parent while they were under the age of 18. And these dehumanizing messages continue to be sent to people who are incarcerated and about people who are incarcerated, but these are people's parents and children and partners. These are people's siblings and their friends and their neighbors. And this message is really unacceptable. And that message is also normalizing, what we'll say is key takeaway number 2, that the standards for prison food currently are exceedingly low. These standards sacrifice health and dignity for low cost and high efficiency. And the problem is that prison food is, quite honestly, really awful, and it has very serious consequences for health and well-being. Yet mass incarceration has codified a system that incentivizes this approach, this low standards for low cost and highest efficiency. And we're allowing this to happen. There's such a critical need for more transparency and accountability. And the systems of oversight that currently exist don't work. A lot of them are really broken. And this is leading to a gap between policy and practice that was very clear in our research. And this can be as simple as something from, there's a listed menu and the food that's actually being served isn't necessarily reflecting what's on that menu. It can say on the menu, oh, there's, a fresh vegetable included with this meal. And that can be a couple tablespoons of shredded iceberg lettuce. So there's that gap there. And also one of the most astonishing gaps that we've noticed is the use of food as a punishment. Most facilities and agencies say that food should never be used as a punishment. We don't use food as a punishment. Yet we heard from so many incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people that food continues to be used as a punishment during their sentences. And you can learn more in much greater detail during, if you look at our 6-part report. And just to go over the report a little bit, part 1 introduces you to the prison food experience and shows you the different dehumanizing aspects of that experience. It also talks a little bit about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on prison food. Part 2 is a deep dive into the short and long-term impacts on physical and mental health for people who are incarcerated, the impacts of that prison food on their well-being. Part 3 explores the harmful impacts of the prison eating environment and also looks at home cooking in prison through the lens of commissary or canteen. Section 4 describes the operational landscape of the food services in prison. So again, bringing in what we learned from visiting facilities and from talking with folks at agencies and in facilities. Section 5 looks at the systems of oversight and accountability that should work, but at the moment mostly are not, and also explores more in depth the topic of food as punishment. And Section 6, which was released today, explores how we can transform our approach to food in prison so that we can actually nourish people and use food as a tool to help people really grow and heal and return more successfully to their communities. So I encourage you all to check it out after this presentation if you haven't had a chance yet. And thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Aishatu.
Thank you so much, Leslie. So very quick, yet so informative and impactful. The work that you and your colleagues did on this report were absolutely amazing. And I've read it, and I'm so excited for everyone to now have access to the entire report. So folks, please log on to the Impact Justice website and you can see the entire report there to read at your leisure, all 6 parts. So I guess, Sam, I will start with you, if that's okay. So Leslie gave a quick synopsis of kind of the impacts of food in prison, and we'll get into later about the food and the environment of eating in prison. But as a person who has been in prison, but I think also as a person who works with people that have also been in prison and our other facilities, can you talk a little bit about whether what Leslie said and what the report has said is consistent to what your experience is like and the folks that you work with? And then maybe even if you can do this for us, can you tell us about your strongest memory you have with eating food in prison?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you everyone for joining. So first, I'll tackle the first question. Strongest memory, and in previous conversation we shared this, for me, were 2 meals, spaghetti and pancakes. To this day, I don't like spaghetti and pancakes, which as a younger person, when I went in as a teenager, spaghetti was actually one of my favorite meals that my mom would cook. Like, even if my mom cooks spaghetti, it's just like, as soon as I see it from my experiences inside, I just don't, it just has some type of psychological pushback. I don't want to even try it. And the pancakes, I don't know why these specific meals just stand out to me, but as a young person, I really used to enjoy pancakes, like fluffy pancakes, banana pancake, all these different pancakes. But after spending 24 years inside, those 2 meals just don't sit well with me, just based on experiences. In terms of the report and specific experiences, so I had a unique experience with food, not just eating the food, but for about 4 years, I worked in the butcher shop in the central kitchen of one of the prisons that I was incarcerated in. And our job was literally to package, to unload, prepare, and ship out to all of the facilities. There were 4 facilities with 6,000 people in the entire institution. And our job was to make sure that each facility received the amount of food, specifically meats and things of that nature, that they were supposed to. And one of the things that we would ship out was soy. I'm not certain, it's been 9 years since I was released, but I'm not certain if they still use soy products. But when I was in, they used a lot of soy. And this came in almost, if you can imagine, dog food sized bags, huge bags like that. And so if we were, say, preparing chicken cacciatore, there was soy product that looked like chicken but was not chicken, and it was 2/3 soy, 1/3 the actual meat. Whether it was ground beef, whether it was chopped beef, whether it was chicken, whatever it was, it was 2/3 of soy product and 1/3 of actual meat. And working in the butcher shop all the time, one of the things that we did, we experimented to find out if we could just cook the soy by itself. And so we literally boiled it and seasoned it, we grilled it, we sauteed it, we baked it, and it all tasted horrible. And then we started reading about it, and we started finding out one of the things that was really bad was too much soy in your diet could cause cancer. And then we started reading all of the labels, and then on some of these labels, it literally said not for human consumption. And we would make these horrible mistakes of actually, when we unload the truck, dropping boxes that would bust open, and we'd have to throw them away. But that was just an inside view that I experienced because I worked in that particular place. Now, physically, my personal experience eating the food, when I walked out of prison, I had hypertension, and I still have hypertension. I know many people who had incredible exercise routines. They ran miles and miles, didn't smoke, didn't use any drugs or anything, but developed things such as diabetes, even though they looked like they shouldn't. They weren't obese or anything like that. How do you develop diabetes? You look at the diet, high in starch, high in sugar. Like, you start understanding what you put into your body is ultimately going to be what develops. And so, especially around the group that I was around, when we started seeing blood pressure, we started trying to figure out how can we avoid this food. And so, even what you can purchase in a canteen would not give you a low sodium, a decent diet, high in vegetables and fruit. You just couldn't buy it because everything in the canteen has to be stored, and so it's high in sodium content. The last thing I'd like to share is just looking at the population as we've been released. I went in as an 18-year-old and I came out 42 years old with high blood pressure. I still exercise. I'm at the 52 now. I'm in pretty good shape. But I've also watched many of my friends that have come home die from stroke. I saw one of the guys named Kelvin, who was much younger than me. He was in a motorcycle accident, and when he went in to have surgery, he was on the phone with us 30 minutes before the surgery, and when they took him in, he had a massive heart attack. And he had only been recently released. And I could only contribute that to what his health was like because of the diet. If we look at this last piece of what I really want to say, if we look at it from a monetary perspective, it costs a lot more for people that are incarcerated to receive all of the medical treatment that's necessary after having a horrible diet for a decade than it would cost if you gave people a healthy diet. It costs more on the back end than it would cost on the front end. If you gave people a healthy diet that would cost a little bit more, it would lessen the health risk. And when a person's released, immediately what happens? I had to go get high blood pressure medication. That costs money. And so if we balanced it out, it would literally cost less to give people more healthy diets in the beginning. And it's the right thing to do because these are human beings that we're talking about. These are our brothers, our sisters, our moms, our dads, our uncles and aunts that will be coming back. Why would we not want to give them the best diets just like we want for ourselves here in the community?
Absolutely. Everything you said, I think almost hits directly on what is in our food and prison report. I think it hits directly on what so much of Leslie and her colleagues talked about in their experiences of talking with folks that were incarcerated. So, I guess one of the questions I have for you, Leslie, around that is, Sam spoke a bit about the physical impacts of what the unhealthy diet did for both him and his friends that were released and some that are still incarcerated. And, what I would also like to talk about is the mental and emotional impacts of that, right? Not just the emotional impacts, but what it means to read something that says not fit for human consumption and still have to consume it. What that does to your mental, your emotional well-being, what it does for you in the environment of what it's like to eat food in prison. So Leslie, can you talk a little bit about maybe even draw on some of the things that Sam said about like what is the emotional and mental impact of food in prison? Even touch on physical if you have any information on that as well.
Sure. So Sam, I know, Sam's experience is really part of a larger trend and a larger pattern of people who eat this food in prison and then come out with various dietary related ailments like diabetes, like hypertension, like heart problems. And I would say the first emotional and mental impact would be simply dealing with having those problems suddenly in your life, is having to learn how to, live with a new normal because your body is now working differently and you might have to change things about the way that you go about doing activities, or you might have to take medications, or you might get sick more. All of these things really change your mental and emotional state. And there are other aspects of eating that really impact mental and emotional health. Are things as simple as nutrient deficiencies, which can cause, aggression or more violent behavior simply because people aren't getting the right nutrients. There are nutritional deficiencies that can lead to depression and anxiety in and of themselves. And, that's on top of, like you were saying, and like Sam was saying, seeing those things labeled not fit for human consumption, basically being told, we're giving you this food, we don't see you as fully human. The amount of depression that can cause, the shame that causes in a person can be really harmful, especially for people who are already within the traumatic experience in that traumatic environment of a prison setting. And Aishatu, you also asked about, some of the lasting emotional and mental impacts. We had people talking about, they came out of prison and they were constantly overeating to the point where they had to be prescribed medication to stop overeating, or they were overeating so fast because they were so used to not knowing whether they'd be able to eat another meal soon, whether they'd have access to edible food. We heard from a lot of people who talked about not wanting to eat food that they didn't prepare themselves because they couldn't trust other people to prepare food for them safely. And this is years after they got out. And to answer the second part of your question about the physical environment, physical environments really matter to us. Things like light and sound and scent can cue physiological and psychological responses in our bodies. So just to use another example, I used to teach middle school and high school students. And when we were in the classroom, if I wanted them to get into a certain mindset or behave in a certain way, I would often turn off the overhead lights and put on quieter music. And if we were doing an activity that required, a more serious conversation, we'd come and sit in a circle on the floor. And those sort of physical cues cause shift in people's minds and bodies that make them focus, or that make them quiet down or calm themselves. And those things also are relevant in a food environment. So for example, restaurants use this in a way to give the room a certain atmosphere, to give people a certain feeling. We do this at home. If you're planning a romantic dinner for your partner, you might dim the lights and light some candles and put on some music. Or if you're having a holiday dinner with lots of family, you might, decorate and make sure the house smells good and put on some, peppier music. We do these things even if we're not actively thinking about them and actively thinking about those responses that our bodies have to these social cues. So the prison food environment acts in the same way. The prison chow hall is often, fluorescent lighting. It's really loud. We had a lot of people telling us it was either really hot in there or freezing cold, so it was uncomfortable. It's often dirty. We had people talking about, bugs flying through all the time and mold on the walls. It smells bad in there. And people go in, it's very regimented. You wait in line. You often take food from a slot where it's just hands passing out the tray. You can't see the person serving you. You're told where to sit. You have officers who are often armed with guns, watching you eat and telling you to hurry up. You only have 5 minutes to shovel all that food down. It's a really stressful place and it makes people feel unsafe. And, there's actual scientific research that shows that things like light and sound impact the way that people interact with food and impact our body's ability to absorb nutrients. But it's also something that's very simple, I think, for a lot of us to understand. There's this very basic issue of eating when we're nervous that I think a lot of people can really relate to. Like, I could not eat breakfast this morning because I was nervous about having to come and talk on this webinar. And, I think for people who are experiencing serious anxiety, like that times 100, day after day, 3 times a day for meals, when we expect to be able to go in and eat food and have that be a nurturing and nourishing experience for us, people who are constantly worried about their safety while they're eating, that's a whole other level. It inhibits digestion, and it could cause like a fight or flight response in your body, which can make you act in more hostile ways also. So that actually just ends up leading to a less safe eating experience for everyone involved.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Leslie. I think, so I'm going to pause really quickly. So folks that are listening in, please continue to write your questions in the chat. I see some of you doing it, but please continue to do that. The last 15 minutes will take some time to answer your questions. The reason I pause that there is because we have folks saying things right now. We've had a couple folks say the smell, 50 exclamation points. One person said likening their experience of Sam's with the spaghetti to the chicken that they experience, So I think, one of the things you talked about was I get nervous when I walk into a bank and there's somebody standing there with the security person with a gun. Like, it makes me nervous to walk into the bank, right? I can't imagine what it feels like to sit in an eating environment with armed guards around you, holding guns with chains and asking you to eat food, right? And I think the other thing that's really interesting to think about is, the folks that are in our prisons, jails, and all detention facilities are primarily Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, right? Those are who have been disproportionately locked up in our communities. Those are also the same people that are over-policed in our communities on the outside, right? Those are the same folks that the Black and Brown communities have over-policing in their community. They're also the ones that experience food deserts in our community, that the kind of good food for all movement almost started because of what was lacking in these Black, Brown, and also poor communities across our nation. And then, Sam, I think you talked about this a little bit earlier in your first remarks about some of your friends. You didn't say their racial identity, but what we know is research talks about hypertension and high blood pressure in Black and Brown communities. So it seems to me that what's being mirrored in our community on the outside is also what's happening in prisons. So I want to start with Sam first. Sam, can you talk about like what that kind of circle effect is looking like in the community that you're a part of, and what that circle effect looks like? And then Leslie, I'm going to kick it to you too and answer the same question from a research perspective.
So I'll start with just I have a large network of friends that are formerly incarcerated, primarily Black and Brown. Most have health issues stemming from diet. Again, going back to hypertension, diabetes. And when I say diabetes, I think in these terms. Imagine like I'm at a good weight. Everything else I'm healthy, with the exception of hypertension, high blood pressure. I have a coworker that I work with, same age, he's diabetic. I have another coworker that I work with, he's pre-diabetic. And all of these instances, and you talk about they're exercising, they're doing all of the things that they're supposed to do, but they spent decades inside eating this food. And so now you see the results of it in the surrounding community. And then in areas like where we shop at, I'll say South LA. If you go into some of the grocery stores in South LA, let's say Food for Less on Slauson and Western, I'll give you specifics. Go to the produce section. Look at the quality of the produce. Look at the quality of the apples, the oranges, the strawberries, the blueberries. I eat a lot of fruit now. I'm really conscious of those things. If you look at it, and then get in your car and drive across town to Beverly Hills, Malibu, any of those places. First of all, you're not going to find a Food for Less. You're not going to find the quality of food that you find in South LA in places like Beverly Hills or Malibu. You're going to find a better quality. How does that happen? And so when you start asking yourself, you have to go see these things, because then the question becomes, well, why is it that way? And I've heard this many times before in discussions like this, or well, not food discussion, but in discussions in general, our system is broken. No. Our system is operating in the way that it was designed to operate. So we have to be intentional about changing those systems, those stores. We should demand better. When you go into these tours, I mean, literally, if you just one day, if you have a weekend that you're not doing nothing and you're bored, just go store hopping, as I call it, and go in places in East LA and Boyle Heights and South LA, and then go across town and go into Malibu and Beverly Hills, and then go into Santa Clarita, and go into the areas, because they're different areas too. And what you'll find is that there's a difference, there's a huge difference in the quality of the food that's actually on the shelves. And when you see that, you have to ask yourself then, why is that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Leslie, I'm gonna kick it to you in just one second. I think there's like a, in the gentrification conversation, people often say, you always know in gentrification starting because you'll see farmers markets and Whole Foods and Trader Joe's start to pop up. I think that kind of illustrates what you're saying, right? We have farmers markets in all those communities, which actually offers fresh produce for less, but in the neighborhoods in which they have higher income, higher income areas. So it's a worked as designed. So Leslie, same type of question, Leslie. What did you see in the research? How was this like circular effect of what's happening in prison happening in our Black and Brown communities, and what are the impacts of that?
So what Sam was saying about there being less access to healthy food and less access to food in general in Black and Brown communities and in lower income communities, that's absolutely mirrored on the inside. And we heard from so many people that access to commissary or canteen, which is where people can buy sort of supplemental food, access to that is really limited by people's finances. And first of all, the canteen food, as Sam was saying before, I think is not healthy to begin with. We didn't come across any facilities where we found fruits or vegetables or fresh products like eggs in the canteen. All that's available is snack food and ultra processed things like ramen noodles. Occasionally there are some healthier options, like maybe some nuts or a granola bar or something, but all of those are really higher priced, and people can't afford those to begin with. Over 60% of our survey respondents told us that they were not able to afford food from commissary, and that the people who had access to commissary were people whose family members could afford to send them money and keep them well financed to be able to buy those things. And unfortunately, people also told us the people who had access to the most food in prison because they had access to commissary were people who are white or who come from a background where they had financial access. So those, that effect is absolutely mirrored. Looking at the larger cycle, Aishatu, I think you also asked a little bit about how does this sort of act as a cycle for people who are coming from communities where there are high rates of incarceration, and then they're going into the prisons and then coming back out. There is some really interesting research that's being done right now on nutrition and trauma, specifically by a wonderful organization based in San Diego called Leah's Pantry. And we've learned that, things like that contribute to toxic stress, things that cause trauma, whether that's something that happens in your own house, like food insecurity or domestic violence, all the way to something that's more of a structural racism issue. Those things contribute to toxic stress, which has a physiological response in our bodies when we're faced with something like that. It can disrupt our gut-brain circuitry. It can cause inflammation in the whole body and so on. And those things actually impact our neurodevelopment. Those things actually impact the ways that we respond to different stressors. And that can also lead people to adopt coping strategies that are then also unhealthy. Things like substance use, things where they might engage in different activities where they can cause harm. And again, because those communities also have less access to healthy food to begin with, people are experiencing nutritional deficiencies, like I mentioned earlier, that can contribute to more aggressive or violent behaviors that either can cause harm or are currently defined as causing harm. And so people are experiencing those things, and then they're put into a prison, which is also a really traumatic experience. And this cycle is perpetuated, and then they're released back out to the community in ways where they've like quite possibly been harmed more. And then it goes back, and it can cycle on, like through the community, it can cycle through the next generation. It's just this continuous thing that doesn't stop. And part of what we need to look at is interrupting that cycle, both in prisons and back out in the community.
Yeah, spot on. I think one of the things that I find most interesting, right, is 99.9% of people that go into prison, it's probably actually higher than 99.9, get out, right? Most people that go into prison and jails get out. And if we're talking about kind of what Sam said, which is the folks that are going to prison already come from poor, lower resource communities that are food deserts. They go back, they go into prison, right, in which they're served not nutritious food that causes things like hypertension, high blood pressure. They get out, they most times go back into their or a similar community that's experiencing the same thing, right? And so it's this kind of circular effect that continues to happen within our communities. And it's not surprising that Sam has talked about your friends and your family that have experienced these drastic health issues, because it's literally a complete circle of unhealthy food choices by no fault of their own, right? I think we talked about it. You talked about it a bit, Sam, which is, in poor communities, you see plenty of liquor stores and little food shops and fast food, right? Sam, I see you nodding, and very few places for fresh produce and vegetables, but also very few, there's not good quality of that, right? So I think that, you get to see, you're both pointing so clearly to how all these things start to connect to each other. Go ahead, Sam, yeah.
I wanted to just share a couple of things. So there's a farmer market in South LA. Guess where it's at? Right down the street from USC. Nowhere else that I know of do I see a farmer's market. It's there every weekend. It's right by the First AME church. I see it all the time. That's my home church, so that's why I'm aware of it. And I always wonder why they don't have more. It's evident. But the other thing I really wanted to point out, and this is sad, like we talk about, especially during this time in this age right now, when we talk about systemic racism, what did they feed slaves? Think about it. You didn't get, you got the leftovers. That's where chitlins came from, which are the intestines of pigs. Like you got the leftovers. And all of the things that we call soul food, it's not soul food, it was slave food. Most of it was slave food. Not some soul food is good, but things like chitlins is not soul food. But this was passed down generation to generation. And then when we look at prisons and how prison, the design of prison, mass incarceration, and all of these pieces, and we start saying, well, we should have expected this. It was meant to be designed this way. We're going to treat you as less than because we see you as less than. And so when we look at it, like if we really take a macro look at everything and we say, well, it started with the Constitution. What did the Constitution define us as? And as we move forward and we look at the immediate elimination of slavery under the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the 6 months later, you had the creation of the 13th Amendment, which says that basically we're going to free you, but we can re-enslave you if you commit a crime. And then just followed it, like literally follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak. And here we are right now today. And all of these things are like literally overlapping in our communities, how we're represented, where our tax dollars are spent at intentionally. And so I think one of the things I saw in the chat box, what can we do about it? One of the things is being intentional and being engaged politically. You have to send those complaints and you have to be consistent about it. For the state of California specifically, a representative for the assembly served 6 years. If that person is going to be in office for 6 years, guess what? For 6 years, you represent me, you're going to know my first, last, and middle name, because me and everyone I can get are going to write and call you until these things are straightened out.
Yeah. Yes, come on, history lesson, Professor Lewis. Thank you. No, you're absolutely right. And you can see the impact of enslavement play out in Black communities today. You see the same thing with for Native communities. You see the creation of what we call reservations, right? You see the same thing play out in Native communities. So again, none of this is happenstance. This is all purposeful, and it takes conversations like this to talk about something like food, right? To talk about how we bring all of that to the forefront. I think one of the questions I have for you, Leslie, is, Sam talked about this being from a place of enslavement to today, right? And, people talk about like slavery was so long ago, yet we're talking about this conversation right here, which is fully tied to food. I guess, we know the message that was being sent to people that were enslaved. And I'm very clear with the message being sent to Black people that were enslaved, right? I'm interested to know, in the work that you saw and the research that you did, what is the message by the food that's served or not served, the environment that folks eat in prison? What is the message that we're sending? When I say we, I mean a society, because I'm not sending that message. I mean we as a carceral society. Like, what is the message that we're sending to Black, brown communities, both in prison and out of prison?
So, as I mentioned earlier, the message that we're currently sending to people who are incarcerated and about people who are incarcerated is basically, you are not worthy of being treated as a person. And that comes in the form of really bad food, of food that, as Sam mentioned, is literally labeled not fit for human consumption. That is right there telling someone you are not fully human. It's that same message that you're talking about from a historical perspective. It hasn't changed. We all use food as a means of communication. That's how we say, I love you to someone. If someone is sick, we bring them soup. If someone is grieving, we bring them a nice hot meal. We celebrate people's birthdays with cake. Like, food is everywhere in the messages that we send and how we communicate relationships, how we communicate people's value to us. And that's not the message that we're sending to people who are incarcerated. And, people who are incarcerated, people who are in prison are human, like full stop right there. People who are incarcerated are human. And food that promotes well-being is a human right. And we're starting to recognize that for everyone else, it seems like, except for the people who are incarcerated, who really need to be part of this conversation. We need to be sending messages of concern and care and recognition of people's capacity to change, and messages that help restore people's dignity, that help get past that shame and that stigma. And the only way to do that is to change our approach to the way we serve food, and really focus on food that is genuinely nourishing, an environment that genuinely restores dignity.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you and Sam have clearly indicated what that message is. So thank you for articulating that so well. I'm going to stick with you, Leslie, because I have a question for you. And Sam, I'm going to circle the same question back to you if you have any thoughts as well. We all do this work, right? Impact Justice does work from restorative justice, conditions of confinement, sexual harm in confinement, re-entry, diversion, right? We work like Impact Justice, just like ARC, just like many organizations, kind of work the continuum of what it means to work within the system and hope to work to dismantle the system. So I guess the question I have for you is, we're talking about food, it feels nuanced, right? It feels like there's big issues at play, right? There's big issues of conditions of confinement, of sexual harm, of dismantling and shrinking systems. So I guess the question I have for you is, why the focus on food? And is this a distraction in any way from what others may see as like a bigger issue in thinking about our criminal legal system?
So first, all the work that IJ is doing, which obviously I love IJ, and all the work that all of our colleague organizations are engaged in is incredibly important. And yes, we do need to be actively engaged in trying to change the structures and the systems and dismantle those systems. But you mentioned things like solitary confinement and aspects that people are really strongly focused on in this movement to change conditions. And I would argue that you can't separate food from any of these other issues. It permeates everything. You think about something like solitary confinement, and people who are in solitary confinement often have less access to food. In our surveys and interviews, we heard from people who said that the food in solitary confinement is, smaller portions. You might get fed less. You might be served Nutriloaf, which is this really disgusting combination of food that's, baked and served in a slice, and that's meant to be your meals for the day. You can't separate the issue of solitary confinement from food. Same thing with healthcare. I know there are a lot of organizations working on healthcare for people who are incarcerated. And like Sam said earlier, if we were serving people better food to begin with, we would have fewer health issues, that make healthcare an even bigger issue. There are organizations that are working on things like communication with family. It's so expensive to call or email your family from prison. And there are people who are having to choose. We heard from people in our survey and our interviews, you have to choose between whether you call your family or whether you buy ramen noodles so that your stomach can be full and you're not, dealing with hunger all the time. So again, you can't separate food from any of these other issues. It infuses all of the other like parts of the conditions of confinement. And food touches every single person who is incarcerated every single day. It's not something that we can ignore even for a short period of time because it has such huge physical and mental and emotional consequences. And you asked about it being a distraction from dismantling these systems. I would argue that, we are working to dismantle these systems, but right now prisons exist and they're not going to go away overnight. And this is something we can do something about now. There are people who need better food now because their lives are at risk. So let's work on changing that while we're still working on dismantling all the other structures.
Yeah, I have a comment, but I want to see if Sam has any thoughts too on, you work across systems, right? You work from juvenile to adult to jail to prison to state. So I guess, Sam, do you have any, thoughts on, is the conversation on food in addition to those conversations, or is it taking us away from some of the bigger conversations we should be having?
I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's a necessary conversation and a necessary change that has to happen across county jails, juvenile facilities, and adult prison systems, period. Food sustains us. Food is what gives us, if we feed people poison, they die. And that's what we're doing for prisons. Again, if we're gonna create a more humane system, a system that's meant to help people become the best versions of themselves, we should want them to be able to eat the way we eat in society. So punish people by giving bad food is just that's not a humane thing to do. It's simply not. And so this is a conversation that's necessary. And not just food, we also have to take into consideration, like CRC has a horrible water supply. Water is necessary. These are things that sustain us that we must have in order for us to live. And so this is part of the change of systems. And I think that this is an important conversation and it's an important change that we need to push for. Yeah, we want to eventually scale down this prison system to pre-1980s numbers. While we're doing that, we want to keep people that are inside healthy because they are human beings. They should be treated and given the respect and decency that anyone in society, we want to give to anyone that's in society. If you want it for your mom, your sister, or your brother, you should want it for people that are currently incarcerated.
No, you're both absolutely right. And I love that you're both continue to say this idea that no matter where you are a human being. And to eat healthy food that helps you thrive and live is a human right. And no matter where you lay your head at night, whether it's in a cell or on a bed or wherever that is, you deserve the right to have good, nutritious food, especially when you don't get to choose what it is, right? When you are in prison, you don't get to choose what you eat. So we better make sure that the food that we're giving you is there to help sustain you and keep you healthy. So I appreciate you both for saying that. I guess, Leslie, a question I have for you, and then I'm gonna go into Q&A, and I'm gonna start with Sam on the Q&A. So I guess one of the questions I have for you, Leslie, is you wrote this amazing report with 6 parts with your colleagues. And do you have any promising practices or things you would point to as things we should be looking at to emulate? And then if you could add on to that, I know, I'm sorry for the compound question, although I guess they've all been compound, is there anything that you're doing with food in prison in terms of leading us to more promising practices?
So I will start off by saying there isn't anywhere that we saw that we would point to and say, this is a model facility or this is a model agency. Look at this, they've gotten everything right. Everywhere we found is definitely, part of the problem. That being said, there are some promising practices that we've seen. A lot of it is really coming down to individuals who are really trying to strike out and do something, that's really different. So for example, I would love to mention Mark McBride is the food service manager at Mountain View Correctional Center in Charleston, Maine. He's an organic farmer himself. He's a veteran of the hospitality industry. He has said to us, I believe food can be medicine or it can be poison. And he has really incorporated a lot of interesting practices into his facility. So he's established relationships with local producers to bring in high quality products for the folks who are incarcerated. He started some really beautiful gardens in their facility and an apple orchard where they're growing heirloom apples. So people are able to actually have fresh produce that comes into the kitchen during the growing season. He's also started an apprenticeship program for people who are working in the kitchen to learn how to bake all kinds of whole grain breads and baked goods. And, he's really trying to make a difference. And the people who are in that facility, we heard that, the meals are still really high carb and there's still the use of fortified beverage mixes and things like that. But looking at that facility compared to others, there is definitely a difference there in some of the food and the amount of fresh produce that's available. There are other places that are trying some other new things. There's a facility in California, in Santee, California, called Las Colinas. It's actually a county jail, but it's the only facility we saw where they've actually made an effort to change the eating environment. And a few years ago, an architectural firm came in. It's a women's facility, and they came in and completely revamped the chow hall. So now it's got this wall of huge windows that let in the natural light. There are sort of softer colors like light greens and browns. There are actual tables and chairs like you'd see in a normal cafeteria space. And I got to visit this facility, and the first thing I thought was, wow, this looks kind of like a museum cafeteria. It doesn't look like a prison chow hall. And just, something that shouldn't be radical, right? Like tables and chairs as opposed to bolted down metal stools. This should not be some crazy idea. But people in that facility, both staff and people who are incarcerated there, have reported that it's a much less stressful eating environment. And it used to be the most stressful place in the facility, people said, but since that change, people feel like they can eat their meals in a little bit more of peace. And so even if the food isn't, as good as it should be, or the portions aren't as big as they should be, at least the environment is a little bit calmer. And there are other places too that are looking at other aspects of food. There's a facility in Ohio where the warden decided that he wanted to incorporate food into family visitation. Normally for family visitation, the only things available are maybe some vending machines where there's soda or maybe candy bars or chips. And he wanted to be able to provide people a chance to eat a meal with their loved ones. And so he started a small pilot initiative where he had some families come to meet their incarcerated loved ones. They had a cookout. They were all able to cook and eat and clean up together. And he said it was a success and he really wanted to repeat it and expand that initiative. That's a great idea. Unfortunately, it happened right before COVID, so I don't think they've had a chance to expand it yet. But, all of these things taken together can really transform more holistically this experience and be able to connect people to their loved ones on the outside, can help people regain their health and restore their dignity. So yeah, there are a number of promising practices that are out there. It's just that a lot of this work is really siloed right now. There are people working at very local levels. There are advocates working on local levels. This is not a brand new conversation. It's just not a national one. And part of what we're trying to do is really foster that national dialogue and connect people who might not have had these conversations together yet to be able to form a larger movement to transform prison food. And you asked what we were doing in terms of our next steps. We are currently partnering with the Nutrition Policy Institute at the University of California to try and get more fresh produce, California grown produce, into California facilities. And we're also talking about some other initiatives. So please definitely stay tuned for the next steps from the Food in Prison Project, because this work is not over. This report is not the end.
Thank you so much for that. I think one of the things that you said that really struck struck me was I've been in many prisons, right? I have been in prisons both to visit people that I loved from being a child up into my adulthood. And because of the work that I do, I've been in many prisons to talk to folks that are in prison. And the one thing I have never done is sat down and had a meal with anybody in prison. And I think that's one purposeful for a variety of reasons, and also a denial of the human experience, you know? So I guess one question I have for you, Sam, in terms of like next steps is, you know, where do folks that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated fit into this movement? Where is, you kind of mentioned a little bit about, you know, contacting elected officials, but like, if you could talk more about your thoughts on, you know, where are the leadership opportunities for folks that are impacted by both our system and also the food that we feed people? Where's their place in this movement?
So in it, like, you have a few organizations right here, Impact Justice, ARC. There are spaces for advocacy, and there are many other organizations that are doing incredible work in this space that are led by formerly incarcerated people and that are staffed by formerly incarcerated people. One of the things that I'm really excited about is voting rights for people that are on parole, and creating, like, activating and creating actual voting blocks in different districts across the state of California to begin with. And then nationally, just thinking in terms of when these things are not, answers to these problems are not met by our leaders or our elected officials, then we basically just tell them, if you're not going to take care of the human beings that are currently incarcerated, we're going to put together a voting block and we're going to vote you out. Like, it's very simple, and it's literally something we need to look at that they did during the civil rights movement. We need to stick together and figure out how do we consolidate our voting power and our voice. But specific to your word or your question, plug into many of the organizations that are doing this work, advocacy work, and this is advocacy work right here. Let's run a policy. What is the policy of the law that we need to change in order to make sure that people in prison actually have more healthier diets? That's something that I'm certain that we can get bipartisan support on, moderate Democrats, progressive Democrats, and Republicans. The bottom line is this is a human issue. So specific to your question, plug into organizations that are doing this work already and make sure that your voice is heard.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you said that I think that I jogged my memory back, when my sister first moved to Oakland, California and was doing some community work, she took some of her colleagues that were from some of the lower income areas of Oakland to a farmer's market for the very first time in their life. These colleagues of hers were in their 30s and 40s and 50s, and she had been picking up fresh produce from the farmer's market. And it's never been lost on me that in their adulthood, that was the first time that they experienced it. And many of them have been incarcerated. So I think one of the things that is also we should start doing is noticing, right? Like, I think one of the things that part of our responsibility as community members is noticing what's around us, who's around us, and who's not there, who's not allowed in here, and understand like how that impacts the entire community that we have, both the folks incarcerated and the folks that are on the outside. So Leslie and Sam, thank you so much. I'm gonna kick it over to some question and answer. We have so many questions in the chat, which I think is amazing. And I think you are generating this amazing conversation that this is the first time I've actually ever been a part of a conversation like this. So I'm gonna start doing some question and answers that I'm getting from folks in the chat. So I'm looking down because I'm looking through chat. So one of the questions I have, and either of you can answer the question, is you both spoke about food that's labeled not fit for human consumption. So I guess the question is really simply is why is that legal in our carceral system for that to be a label and for people to still be forced to eat that? Either of you can answer. And if you don't have an answer, totally fine there too.
So I don't know that it's actually legal. And I do know when we raised a bit of a ruckus, when we would either, a couple of things would happen. If we 602'd it or we brought it to the attention of staff, a couple of things would happen when I was inside. You either get moved from your job assignment or you end up getting written up by someone and moved from your job assignment. So you're eliminated, so to speak. So that's one. The other thing is and again, going back to what you said, is this a waste of time? Actually, this is a conversation that should have been happening a long time ago. And so this, I think, is a policy issue. And now that people that are incarcerated actually have a voice, so to speak, because you have all of these great organizations such as Impact Justice, ARC, and other organizations that are pushing for change. Now is the time for us to push for that change that we've always looked for when we were on the inside. So to your specific to your question, I don't think that it's legal, but now we can magnify it. Like, let's go inside with some of our electeds, because we have some amazing elected officials too that really want to change the system. Assemblymember Kamlaker Dove, Reggie Jones Sawyer, and others that really want to change the system. And maybe we set up, like, let's go into the butcher shop and let's do an inventory of all their food and let's read some labels.
Yeah. Leslie, do you have a comment on that? What?
It's an excellent question. I don't know how it's legal either. I mean, that's, I guess partly like a rhetorical question. Why would we allow this to happen? And yes, we should be looking more into the actual legality of that. Unfortunately, a lot of times when people do take these things to the courts and they're arguing that this goes against the Eighth Amendment, against cruel and unusual punishment, there isn't really a definition of cruel and unusual punishment that isn't subjective. So it really often comes down to an individual judge's ruling as to whether or not this kind of food is legal. So yes, that's definitely something that we should look into more, and I encourage other people to look into it as well.
Yeah. I think one of the things that Sam and both you mentioned, and I'll just like add a couple of things in, is the conversations about the food and the environment of food in prison is not a new conversation, but as Leslie has said, has happened in silos across this nation. But this, from my understanding, is the first kind of big national conversation that's been started through this. So I think that we're going to find a whole lot of questions that we don't know the answer to. And I think one of our goals at Impact Justice is to dig into that, to take questions like, right now we have 56 questions, to take so many of those questions and start to do the work to find some of those answers, because we too have them. And once we get answers to that, we can start doing a lot of movement work to fix some of the things that they're saying. So one of the questions I have, and this is for both of you too, is how common or uncommon is it to find a produce garden inside prison? So within the comments today, we've had a bunch of people talk about gardens that are in prison. So how common or uncommon is that? And would those gardens be able to help produce more food in kitchens?
So I know Insight Garden Program a project, which is they're on in the chat box. I believe they're in 11 prisons. However, I believe that most of the institutions do not allow the planted produce that's grown to be actually used in the kitchen. You have to donate it, which I think is ridiculous. Especially, this is probably the healthiest thing that you could give the population. And it costs you almost no money. Like, why not say every prison should have a huge garden, and we're going to take this produce and we'll test whatever's necessary and we're going to put it in the kitchen. But to your point, I believe there are 11 institutions. Yeah, matter of fact, well, yes, 11 prisons, but our gardens are typically small. And so in the chat, literally they're talking about, but Insight Garden Project is a great organization that does this work in 11 of the 35 prisons in California, but they're not big gardens, but they have the ability to scale if given the opportunity and the funding. And again, that funding on the front end, on the back end, it might cost a little money, but on the front end, it will be invaluable in both lives and medical costs.
Leslie, thoughts, or do you want me to move on?
Yeah, Sam's correct. There are many gardens and garden programs throughout the country where the folks who are growing the produce there are not actually allowed to eat the food that is grown in the garden. And that is true for places that have both smaller gardens as part of programs and as places that have like larger farms in their facility, about whether or not they're actually allowed to eat that food and whether it goes into the facility kitchens. So yes, it's definitely an issue. Gardens are a great idea. There is also the issue of people being asked to work farms and gardens for very little pay, for no pay at all. We do have more about this in the report, so I definitely encourage you to look a little bit more at Section 4 if you'd like to learn more about the farming issue, and I believe Section 2 to talk about some of the garden programs.
So question, how would you, and Sam, you talked a bit about this, so I just want to get like a really clear answer because I've got the question a couple of times, is how do you respond to the conversation of it costs a lot of money to provide quality foods for people in prison? How do you apply to that question, or to that argument, I suppose? How do you apply?
I said it earlier, and love that we did it. On the front end, it will cost a lot of money. But on the back end, the cost savings in medical care and prescription medication and doctors and all of the trips as a person gets these ailments from a bad diet covers that. So literally it balances out. It won't cost more. And more importantly, I think what's even more importantly is these are human beings. Why would you not want to give them the best opportunity or give them the same food that you eat? And the last thing I'll say is the prison population is now down drastically from when I was incarcerated, which was, I think it was 178,000. And we're at about 91 or 92,000 today, I think. So cost should not be an issue. And it balances out on the back end anyway.
I think the other thing I would add to that is, from my knowledge, and Leslie would love for you to jump in, there hasn't been a big cost benefit analysis around that. There hasn't been like a big actual cost benefit analysis to know what that difference would look like. And I would love to see that, because actually I think that after that's done, we'll have a better argument to talk about, the cost of this, because it's actually extremely expensive right now to feed people in prison really, really bad food. It's really, it's a big cost that, I think that once we understand those numbers better, we could probably have an argument that may lead to the counter of it may cost less on both ends of that. But I would love to see something like that. I don't know if you have a response to that, Leslie, but I would like to ask you a question that I just got too, so you can respond to both of them, I think, which is, one, I just asked you. And then two, people are asking, what about jails, detention facilities, tribal facilities? What about other places outside of prison?
So to answer your first question, everything that Sam said, yes. And also, the food budget is usually a very small portion of a prison's entire operating budget or an agency's entire operating budget. In several states, we saw the statistic was that food services was about 4% of the entire agency's operating budget. So like you were saying, you might not even need to spend more if you're just taking some of the money out of the healthcare sector spending and putting it into the food spending. That could make a difference right there. And it also might, as we're arguing, help lower costs for security, or help prevent things that are expensive for the prison, like people rioting because the food is bad, or people, like there are so many benefits to increasing spending on food, because in the long term that might actually save money. And yes, again, on the human rights aspect, the money is obviously a huge issue, but also it really is about human rights and people being able to have the food they need. Your second question about what about jails, tribal facilities, youth facilities? Yes, all of those are very important. And we have heard similar patterns in those kinds of facilities as we learned when we were really diving into state prisons. Unfortunately, with our project, we had to narrow it down somewhere because the scope was so large, and we chose state prisons partly because that's where over half of the people who are locked up in this country are spending their time, and they're often there for very long periods of time. So yes, we are hoping to start looking at jails and youth facilities, tribal facilities, community detention centers, immigration detention. Like, we'd love to explore these other facilities. If you know anything about food there, please feel free to reach out to us. And yes, those places are also important too.
Thank you. I think something amazing is happening right now, like as we're talking, is Leslie talked earlier about the Food in Prison Project hoping to create a dialogue around this issue. There is so much movement building happening in our chat right now, with people sharing emails and talking about things. So this is literally made my entire week about just watching this happen. This is literally the point of this conversation. So I am so excited to do it. And if you're not joining on that chat, please join in now, because folks are really talking about this movement. One last question before we kind of wrap up is, how much do you think that the nutrition standards similar to those at the National School Lunch Program would help provide more quality food in prisons? I understand schools are different than prisons, but someone's asking, do you think that the conversation on healthier food in schools would benefit the conversation on healthier food in prison? Don't know if either of you have an answer to that.
I think that it would, because right now, as I recall, the standard inside is just the bare minimum of what meets a nutritionist requirement for a person. But let's stop and think about that. Like, every person that's 25 or a certain age, like, there are different nutritional needs for different size people. just because it says an adult male or adult female should eat or have this many calories doesn't mean that that's true for all people of that age. And you know, so, but they base it on the bare minimum of what's required, certain amount of calories, etc. And so I don't think that that's a good measure when you're talking about human beings.
Leslie.
Yeah, I agree with Sam. Then we also talk in the report about how you can create standards, and if you're doing them for the sort of average person, that's also not necessarily meeting everyone's needs, and it's also potentially taking away people's agency to choose what they need for their own bodies. That being said, it is a good idea to have some sort of policy and standards in place. There are groups right now who I know are trying to work on that a little bit, on creating policy recommendations for correctional facilities. Looking at school lunch specifically, I think that's an interesting place to start looking as a model, and definitely something to think about. Sure.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, everyone. We are not going to be able to get to all the amazing questions that were being asked, but we are definitely taking note of them. I'm also getting a lot of questions. This is absolutely being recorded, and because you registered, we'll send this back out to you that you can share widely with everyone. Before I completely wrap up, I do want to give both Leslie and Sam an opportunity to have a last word. So Leslie, I'll start with you. Any last word you want to leave on folks about the conversation on food in prison?
This is such a huge and important issue, and thank you so much for everyone who's writing in the chat about wanting to connect with other folks. Like Aishatu said, I love to see this movement building happening in the chat right here. This is amazing. Please read the report, and please feel free to reach out to us with questions or ideas. We would love to continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
For me, seeing all of the movement building in the chat box, get involved, make sure that your voice is heard, reach out. We know, especially people that have been in the system and people who have family members that are in the system, your voice is more powerful than you realize. Your elected officials do listen, but you have to write and call. They will listen to you. They know that if you're gonna call and write, they know that you'll also show up at the ballot box and they will listen to you. So please get involved. Don't be afraid. Make sure that you understand that your vote and your voice matter in changing our system.
Thank you both so much for being part of this conversation. This has been such a learning lesson for me, and I know folks are saying it's a learning lesson for them on the chat. So Sam, thank you for sharing your personal experience with us. We are undeserving of that. Thank you, Leslie, so much for the work that you and your colleagues did on this report. It's absolutely remarkable. Folks, like we said, all 6 parts of this report are released today, are all open today. Please read the report. We are literally looking out for your feedback and your comments. The goal really around this Food in Prison project and Eating Behind Bars is to start a dialogue just like this, so we can continue to dive deep into this conversation that both Leslie and Sam have said should have been talked about a long time ago on such a national scale. So this is the first conversation we're having of this. We plan to have many more over the course of 2021 and hopefully much longer than that, because we hope that this begins to become a movement, both from Impact Justice, ARSD, but also all of you on the ground that are really caring about this issue. So please stay tuned to more events that we'll have at Impact Justice. Please sign up for our mailing list. You go on impactjustice.org. You can sign up for our mailing list. You'll hear all about the things that we're doing, and you'll hear more about the Food in Prison Project and the amazing work they're doing over there. So thank you all for attending, and it has been so great to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.